Welcome to the Condemned Logic Season 1 finale. This is going to be sort of a Season 1 retrospective. We'll talk about some of our favorite things about this past season, what we learned, and maybe go into a little bit of behind the scenes stuff, kind of how we go about preparing each topic and all that stuff. So, what did you think about our debut season so far?
I really enjoyed it. I had a good time. This is the first time I've made a podcast or tried something like that. I've definitely learned a lot about the process and what I would do differently as far as planning. Maybe we can talk about that a little bit first because I feel like as we were going, we were getting better at it.
Yeah, I agree. I think our the last few topics we did, the Munster Rebellion in particular, I feel like was our best researched, and I think it was because we really divvied up the labor, I think, really well on that one. And I think the other thing too is we were both really excited about it. Like the more we learned about it as we were doing our research, the more excited we both got about it. So it got to the point where, I think all of those two-part episodes we recorded in one shot just because we were like, this is gonna have to be a two-parter, you know? So that worked out good.
Yeah, and then I think the last few episodes, the Heaven's Gate and the Munster, they were both in one of our wheelhouses too. So someone could kind of there's someone to fall back on for the information when the conversations start to lag. So that was a benefit as well. Um, yeah, I'm always in a weird, and maybe you can speak to this in your view of it. But me personally, I'm in a weird place when I'm presenting information to people, especially like historical information, because I don't want to mislead anyone or present information that I'm not familiar with. But we also kind of set this up where we're like, well, we don't want to come across as like two scholars. You want to be like two guys who are like learning about this thing with you as well. So then there's kind of like a middle ground because on one side I have this obligation to present the most correct information I can, but then on the other side, like, well, I know I'm not going to be a scholar on this subject necessarily, so there could be a conflict there.
Yeah, I liked that. I liked how that sort of played out, how it was sort of this is sort of an exploratory project where we pick a topic for each week and we kind of commit to um learning as much as we can within a week and then kind of just reporting on what we found. Um, you said this is the first time that you've done anything like this. I'm obviously I've had this channel for a few years. Um, you're not the first person that I've talked to about doing some kind of collaborative work, but you're really the first person that has actually come through and really wanted to. Like I've had a few people that either I've reached out to or have reached out to me, and for one reason or another, either I'm not fully committed or they're not fully able to do it at that time, but it just worked out well that we were both um, interested enough to do this, and we were able to kind of hold each other accountable, um, which was I think was good, especially for me. I need to be held accountable.
Yeah, I mean, we've had some history together too, talking about subjects, and there's times we can be at each other's throat a little bit, like a few times. But one thing I've always appreciated and why I wanted to do something with these because I feel like we're very intellectual about it. Like I don't feel like we take it personally. It's more of a if we're clashing, it's because some kind of um intellectual things going wrong, not like a personality thing necessarily.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I definitely agree with that.
So yeah, I feel like but for the most part, I think we do agree on our general process of uh or maybe it's like not our process, our like goal with philosophy maybe is what we agree on. There's something we definitely mesh really well on, and it might be that.
Well, I think I definitely noticed it when it came time to talk about my personal favorite new religious group, which is Heaven's Gate. And we seemed to really mesh on I call it the non-doxastic, or I call it the doxastic approach as opposed to the non-doxastic. So basically deciding at the outset to interpret this group's actions and practices in terms of what they professed to believe, rather than these sort of speculative kind of guesses, I suppose you could call it, about their psychology, sort of deciding like,
Yeah.
maybe I actually don't have access to another person's inner thoughts, and maybe I should just go off of what they claim they believe and connect their actions to those beliefs, leaving open the possibility that there might be uh some sort of psychological thing at play, whether it's cognitive dissonance or the sunk cost fallacy, all those psychological buzzwords that tend to get thrown into the cult discourse. But I think we kind of were like, this is something that I try to avoid just because it's something that I feel like has been talked to death already. And coming at like the study of religious movements from a philosophical background, which we both have degrees in philosophy, as opposed to like a sociological or psychological. I'm not saying it's necessarily better or worse or right or wrong, but it's just different. It's not something that I see as much of. And I think that's something where we both kind of were in a line with.
Yeah, I agree for sure. And I think I'm getting a bunch of thoughts here at once, so excuse me, but so I'm gonna start my first, which is the sociology thing. I think sociology or like anthropology perspective can be fine. Like the guy whose article you sent me, I forgot his name. Can you remind me?
Balch, Robert
Balch.
Balch.
He did an amazing job. I think, yeah. Like, but then I feel like the problem comes when people are doing armchair sociology and then they're trying to kind of like guess all the patterns of this cult that they have no part in. They're not even looking at this guy's research really, because he's too like because if they did, he'd be like, well, this is not really what I saw in it, right? And again, he's one period of this cult, right, or whatever we want to call it, but yeah. So I think that people go wrong because the actual sociologists, they're saying one thing, but then you see a whole different story on the television. And even when they're citing these people, they're ignoring those parts. So I think that's problematic. And I was going to say on the other side is I think one of the earliest things that me and you talked about that I think we got along with was Marx, because I feel like we have a shared perspective on that too, which is neither of us are Marxists, right? Like we're
Right.
not
Even
like
though we constantly get accused of being Marxists by people on the internet, it seems
yeah,
like.
constantly. We read Marx as a philosopher and we enjoy some things he says. We don't like
Mhm.
other things he says, but it's really not even about whether we like it or not. It's whether we think what he's saying is cogent or not. And so I feel like that's where we got along in that regard. So that kind of overlaps with how we were viewing like these other things as well.
Right. Well, with Marx, you get this materialist analysis of history where we're looking at, what are the material conditions, what are the social conditions, what are the ingredients that are already in existence in a particular cultural milieu from which these groups can uh, take and then kind of create their own thing out of it. I mean, you can get that from anything. You don't have to read Karl Marx to get that. But at least for me, that was reading Marx was what kind of introduced that way of looking at history to me
Mhm.
in the first place.
Yeah. Yeah. And I like to read Marx from a perspective of like what is he saying and not from a perspective of what do I want to disagree with him about or what the fuck's wrong with this commie or whatever. However people are go approaching it, that's just not my thing. Like
Well, and it's weird too. I think just even saying we're reading Marx as a philosopher, that already puts us at odds with many Marxists who despise the idea of treating Marx as a philosopher.
yeah, that's a problem, I think.
So we end up irritating people on all sides of the spectrum, the Marxists and the anti-Marxists.
well, and I get where they're coming from in a way because I do think there is a kernel of that too, but I just I think that if you really want to like I don't even want to say that. I don't want to be too normative about it. I think that there's value in having a perspective outside of the parameters of the ideology that you're working in. And I think it's a shame, even if you, there's nothing wrong with viewing it internal to the ideology, but it's a shame if you don't want to look outside of that and get mad if people try to, right? There's no threat to you from that. It's just another thing that is promoting and discussing the idea that you ostensibly care about. So I don't see what the problem is.
Right. Yeah, you want to use all the tools available. If your goal is to get as accurate an analysis of the conditions at play in your society, you know, chances are it might be helpful to have more than one tool in your toolbox.
Yeah,
You've been doing a lot of work for a while on sort of like a kind of like a long-term project of like a history of ideas within mid the medieval times, I guess, medieval history sort of thing, and looking at sort of the development of various major lines of thought and the sort of debates that kind of characterize that period of the history of philosophy and religion and society. How did that sort of work kind of play into the way that you went about analyzing some of the groups that we covered in this series?
yeah. I think on Moonster, I really that's shown up the most because I noticed rewatching and re-listening to it that we did a pretty good job explaining the different um, trains of thought that were going on with like Martin Luther and the Eucharist and baptism and why these things were so personal to people and then why these ended up being such a momentous like cause in the times. So I think that that research really allows me to kind of understand what the stakes were for the people at the time, why they cared about something that seems to us as modern viewers something so trivial as like putting water on someone's head, right? Like it seems silly at first, and I see why it seems silly to people, but it's not when you think about the deeper meaning and symbolism that this stuff has to these people and why it's important for them, right? Like you're literally publicly reifying and displaying your faith in a way that is fundamentally at odds with the power that is claiming to be the universal power, the universal church, the universal truth, right? So that's like a very powerful thing. If you don't research it and get into the nitty gritty, sometimes it just doesn't come across to you. I know that I've learned a lot myself, like deep diving it, and I see like, okay, now I can really understand why there was so much at stake for these people.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, the things they were debating about, I think if you looked at any of them, like ultimately it came down to some sort of debate over how do you get into heaven? That's a pretty big thing to debate about. That's a pretty
Yeah,
important issue to settle, I would imagine.
it becomes about salvation, but I also here's what I notice: it's about truth. Who's the truth maker in this society?
Mm.
Who gets to decide what is true, the process of adjudicating what's true, um, how does truth trickle down into the political sphere, and how is the government and the religion become the arbiter of the truth for people? Where does that derive from? What's the power base, the power structure? And all of that is seen in Moonster really well, right? Because we have people who say justification comes from faith alone. Well, now we have an epistemic claim as well, like your truth is coming through faith and not from like some logical argument, right? We're pushing aside the traditional like Thomas Aquinas view, and we're accepting more of um, the Bonaventure view. And so we have to look and think about that, right? Like what who are the truth makers in society? Where's it coming from? The truth is what really decides everything below it. I think, for these debates and these arguments.
What do you think was your favorite topic that we covered?
Um, that was tricky because I liked a few for different reasons. I mean, the one I'm most excited about would be Moonster because it's more in my wheelhouse. But then I think I learned the most from the Heaven's Gate one, because I just not familiar with that world of like sociology. Really, I just haven't looked into it. I haven't even looked at some cults. Never like interested in me. I always had a suspicion that it was kind of like a silly way of talking about of like very important phenomena, and I feel like it kind of just turns into like garbage TV, kind of like alien stuff. Um, so those two were big for me. I also really like the Schopenhauer one we did. Honestly, I feel like it turned out better than I thought off the cuff. I kind of got back into Schopenhauer's writings. And what about you?
Yeah, I mean, I probably feel the same way. I mean, my favorite was definitely the Heaven's Gate one, again, because that's a group that I have studied a lot and I love talking about them. But I also feel like I ended up learning the most from the Munster one. So it was kind of the inverse for me. Um, the Schopenhauer one, I think part of what made that good was I think we decided to focus we our focus was very narrow. We decided to focus on like mainly one chapter of World as Will and Representation with maybe like we focused on chapter 68 and I think we looked at 67 and 69 a little bit.
Yeah,
Um,
we drifted
and
into them a little bit. Yeah,
and it also helps that his argument and his writing is pretty lucid. It's pretty straightforward. I think that was something we commented on or you commented on in the video is that it basically is just like a deductive argument for, in one way or another. So that helps always.
yeah,
If we tried to focus on like one chapter of a book by Deleuze or something, it
yeah.
might, having such a narrow focus uh, might not do the trick there.
It would break
Um,
apart.
right. And we got some good feedback, I feel like, from some of our friends on the Schopenhauer episode. I think a lot of that is because he is a really popular philosopher. There's definitely a resurgence of interest in people like him. What do you think that's about? What do you think is the I mean, I don't know if you've seen that, but I've definitely seen it. There's like a couple of YouTube channels that are like almost exclusively deal with Schopenhauer's philosophy.
I haven't looked into it too much. Again, I try to avoid pop stuff in general, but I think I think his ethic views are along the lines of Stoicism, and I think Stoicism had a resurgence as well. These kind of like views for especially young men to like kind of um, not be invested in the society around them and finding ways of like promoting themselves in like a ego. I guess I know he's against the ego, so to speak, but like in a self-centered way, like taking yourself away from the harms of society that are being caused upon you. I feel like there's a big interest in that with young men lately. I don't know why.
Yeah, I mean, that's like a whole separate topic that definitely warrants a deep dive. Maybe something we could explore at some point in the future. Um, I feel like, this kind of goes back to maybe one topic where we have clashed on, um, and that's the sort of the spectrum of individualism as opposed to collectivism. I think you definitely veer more towards a collectivist view of things. I tend to veer towards more of an individualist, I guess, look at things. But and I think that served as the topic of a debate that we had on the
Yeah.
Ooze Debates channel. Although I don't think it was called that at the time. I think it was when it was still Capitalism versus Socialism was the name of the channel. But
Well,
long
you were
story
being
short,
focused.
yeah.
You weren't even supposed to debate. The
Oh,
one
that's
guy
right. Yeah, I was filling in for somebody and it just turned
filled
into
in.
that. Yeah.
And then you're kind of like, I don't know where to go with this, and then you just did your your natural inclinations.
But I think the more I talked to you, the more I realized that I actually there is a little bit of a collectivist streak in my thinking. And I feel like the interest that I have in a group like Heaven's Gate, I think is one place where I kind of see that come out. Because I like this idea of ultimately the goal being you know, the emancipation of the individual, if you want to put it in those terms, or, you know, making things, organizing things in such a way that allows an individual to um express themselves, become themselves, discover themselves. There's a lot of different ways we could talk about it. But one of the interesting things that you see in a group like Heaven's Gate is that one of the best ways to do that, to refine yourself as an individual, is not to isolate yourself from a community, but to fully embed yourself in one where your concerns are not just yours, but also the group. And also that a lot of times self-denial is an important ingredient in self-development. And I think that's something that is missing in a lot of the kind of
Yes.
Robinson Crusoe brand of individualism, you
And
know?
that's why no, I like that because that's what I was trying to say with Schopenhauer. Like I know he's against the individual in one sense, but almost denying yourself becomes a better way of being yourself with him, I guess. And I feel like that's the same with Stoicism, and that's kind of where that could be in line with a group like Heaven's Gate too, right? So I think that's very astute of you to point out. And I also think, I'm not really against individualism. This is why, like, sometimes this individualist versus collective, I don't even like the term collectivist because I feel like it's used negatively most of the time. It's kind of like just a garbage term to make something look bad that they don't understand. But I, I'm not against individualism. I just think that the way we talk about it is silly. Um, because, I'll take Heaven's Gate for instance, right? Those people don't have a kind of um, principle in which to deny themselves unless they have the backdrop of Heaven's Gate kind of informing them upon what the, I guess, horizon of values that they could have is, right? So Heaven's Gate provides them a horizon of values in which to judge their own values against. And I feel like that's when we look at individualism from this perspective that we're like just generating these values from within ourselves and they're just coming from our own inner desire. That's just not how reality works. We don't just come up with things. Like we interact with the world and that informs our desires. And then those desires go back and interact with the world. And so we have now a more coherence model, an interaction between yourself and the world. And we see like with Moonster, Heaven's Gate, these people start changing the world around them based on their desires, and those changes start to change them and they get new ideas from that. And so when we use this old model of like we use an organized society purely around expressing ourselves, it's like it doesn't make sense. It's incoherent because that's not where our values come from. There's more to it than just expressing yourselves. We need to look at how can we organize society to also elevate those important components of creating meaning, right? We talk about that with ritual. We talk about that with like the truth makers, the epistemology, the leadership crises. Like, how can we elevate those and make society focused on creating stability in those realms rather than just destroying it and focusing on making the individual like king of the world, right? We have this like vacuous self-creation being happening. And I think that's why people are drawn to things like Schopenhauer and Stoicism, because we have such a vacuous concept of meaning in our society right now. That's my view.
I would add to that that it's also, at least in my experience, it's not very fulfilling to just organize my existence around mere self-expression for self-expression's sake, which is ironic because it's usually like people that get into that, it's usually motivated by this desire to have a more fulfilling existence. But ironically, if my actions have no other human beings as a referent or even a consideration, um, that's ironically not a very fulfilling existence for me, you know?
Yeah, so Charles Taylor, this philosopher I'm really into, he's a Canadian communitarian, which is what my preferred philosophy, not collectivism. But he talks about how if you just look at your values in a vacuum, they're not significant. It's not significant if you go to the store and you pick out Fruit Loops because you like Fruit Loops against all these other cereals because there's nothing that's like a meaningless decision, right? Making a decision has no meaning unless it's significant to you. And well, guess what makes things significant? It's based on what other people think about it. What is the stakes of the decision? What what is going to change about your life and everyone else's life based on that decision, right? So it can't be a purely individualist perspective that makes these things important. There has to be some kind of group dynamic that is making it significant.
That could significance doesn't have to be like everything I do is world changing. Um, you know,
Yeah,
it can just be if it's just for one other person, and usually there's a lot of middle grounds between that too. Like, just thinking about like what can I do for my community today? And my community might be my job, my family, my neighbors, it might be people that I bump into at the store. Just what can I do for other people in my little corner of the world today? You know?
yeah. So, and that points me to another thought I'm thinking too, because I think that's right, right? Like, it's a spectrum of what matters. Obviously, I don't think everything needs to be significant for like some things are just insignificant. But I think the problem then becomes so with the kind of I'll call it like the radical individualist perspective, everything becomes too significant and then not significant at all, right? Like because you really can see sometimes people think that like little tiny things like you have to wear a seatbelt or you have to like they're changing the rules on gas stoves or like what was it incandescent light bulbs and it's like every little thing that you do becomes a significant thing for you and it's just like no it does not matter if you have to use a different light bulb. It doesn't matter if you have to wear a seatbelt in the car. It doesn't matter if you have to choose a different like one variety of cereal's gone, right? Or like someone puts a person of like I don't know LGBT or trans on your beer bottle and you got to like protest. Like everything just becomes too significant, right? But then on the other hand, you have this opposite problem where nothing's significant anymore, right? Because we're like there's just so much bull crap, bullshit. I don't know if we want to cut it not on our channel,
Yeah, that's fine.
but yeah, there's just all this bullshit like that we're supposed to care about because everyone has their own thing that they are concerned about. I don't want to call it like I know I give a lot of right wing examples, but I think the left does it too. But but ultimately it becomes like nothing significant now because all these problems just no you can't care about this stuff when everything's significant anymore because it just loses the significance. It's just another variety of cereal on the aisle that you're picking from. Oh, I'm a anti-realist. I'm a conservative Republican. I'm a like whatever like gender thing that we're gonna have like to bring it down to, right? Like just everything just becomes an identity, a mask that you slip on, and I just feel like it starts to lose the significance as well.
Well, isn't that an exam one of the is that isn't that an example of one of the iterations of Sartre's bad faith, right? Identifying too closely or too completely with uh some identity or something like that, like your job or your gender or nationality or something.
Yeah, I'm not sure how it might relate to what I'm saying, because my inkling is that Sartre and those guys are partly responsible for this phenomenon.
That's the problem. I was debating
Yeah.
whether to even bring him up or not, because yeah, I think a lot of this goes back to existentialism, which is well, I don't think enough people talk about it enough as this is a hyper individualist philosophy, and if that's what you're into, that's fine, but I think people should be aware that is what you're buying into. You're buying into a very individualist way of looking at the world.
What kind of makes you I guess with the bad faith, it makes you set up with a complex where you're like, if you're doing something that's not generated from yourself, you're always at risk of having this bad faith attitude. And if you're in this state of bad faith, it brings about like this kind of existential dread or anguish, or anxiety. And so it's kind
It's
of
kind
set
of
up
just
to where,
reinventing the concept of sin and calling it secularity.
yeah. If you look to like the Charles Taylor thing that I recommend, he talks about how it starts with Rousseau. He calls it the ethic of authenticity. Like being authentic becomes the primary thing. I don't. There's problems with his views as well. I think he gets a little too conservative with it because he starts talking about like um homosexuality in a certain way that I don't know if I agree with. But other than that, I mean, it's a pretty good. It's pretty good if you just look at the strict argument and kind of try to navigate around some of these nonsense.
Well, I've had conversations with a friend of ours. I know you've talked to them too. Josh, who writes he writes a Substack called Anthemic Lullaby, and me and him have talked about this in terms of like the meaning discourse, meaning of life stuff in connection to like pop philosophy today. And he brought up what I thought was a really cool point. I think he brought it up during the debate that I had with someone on whether or not the concept of life's meaning is even a coherent concept. I think that was the topic. And Josh and I were talking about it at the end, and he was like, my problem with the whole meaning of life stuff is like it almost puts like too much pressure on a person where it's like everything I do has to be meaningful and I have to be this authentic person, but sometimes I just want to enjoy the moment for what it is. I just want to enjoy a sunset or something like that. That maybe the meaning of life stuff is not necessarily as emancipatory as it's usually billed.
Yeah, so I'll bring another concept. I listened. I had maybe we can link it in the video at some point because I have a lot of names in my head and I cannot cite this guy right now. But it was a professor from MIT talking about telic versus atelic activities and how they relate to midlife crises. On it was on Philosophy Bites. Um, but he was talking the way that he broke it down made a lot of sense to me because he was saying the reason why he thinks that a lot of people end up having midlife crises and like these crises of meaning in their life is because they focus their whole life on what he calls telic activities, which are activities that have an objective end. Like I'm going to write this book or this novel. I'm going to become like this best football player. I'm going to become a rock star and become famous, right? Once you do that, now you have nothing to do. Now you have no meaning in your life. And so we've structured our society around these very telic activities instead of doing what he calls the atelic activities, which would be like watching a sunset. You can structure some of these ideas that we would think are telic normally, like writing a book, to be atelic. Like when I do these medieval notes, I am doing it because I enjoy doing the activity, not because I just want to have this book produced. In fact, I don't even care if it ever gets produced. But I think a lot of people, when they set out to do these activities, that's not what they care about. And I wonder if Josh is getting onto something like that. Like maybe the atelic activities, these kind of meaningless activities without like a teleology to them, those would be more fruitful for your mental health. Not that you should never have telic activities, but they just shouldn't be, your life shouldn't be organized purely around.
I thought that one good topic to maybe end on would be to talk a little bit about sort of how we go about actually preparing each episode.
Well, when we started with Hegesius, we kind of were haphazard. I threw a bunch of sources at you that I thought would be interesting. I was like, let's just kind of pilot it with this guy. And I thought it was a good one to choose because neither of us knew much about him. I had just encountered him, and you're like, okay, I don't know anything about this either. Let's just go for it. So that was a fun one. And then I think the second episode with Schopenhauer, you suggested it explicitly. um, Something about Hegesias that got your mind thinking about Schopenhauer in that chapter. Um, and the second one, I noticed that we started to get more of a process, so to speak, because then we were like, I don't know if we took notes yet. That was more like the third one, I think. With the was Rappaport the third one, or was that the fourth?
Yeah, that was number three.
Yeah. So Rappaport is where I think our process kind of got cemented, is where we would pick like a piece of a writing. With Rappaport, it was like chapter one, the introduction of that book. And we just planned to read it. And then we made like a shared doc and we put notes that we wanted to cover. And just so that we are somewhat of the same page, because I think the first two were a little, I guess, haphazard, I guess, for my tastes. Not too
Yeah, well, we
bad.
didn't have any sort of intro music at the time either. We just sort of jumped right into it. I tried to open with a joke the first couple times, but I think we got some negative feedback about that. So I stopped doing that. And
We
then you
got
ended
negative
up
feedback about the joke. I didn't even know.
Oh, I guess I just assumed like didn't you share the episode with someone and they were like, it's kind of weird how you just sort of start talking, you should have like
Oh
an
yeah,
intro
yeah.
song or something.
I think yeah.
Which you recorded the intro song, which we've gotten some good feedback on. I think one of the last comments I saw on one of our videos was somebody talking about how much they liked the music at the beginning.
Oh yeah, that was fun. Actually, I had written that a while ago. It was just like a little interlude in another song I had, but I never really did anything with the song. So I'm like, I really like that melody though. So I'm just gonna record it and
I liked it. It was kind of giving me some Leonard Cohen vibes a little bit with the finger picking.
yeah.
What always happens with me is after we record the episode and I go in and I start editing it and I'm listening to it for the first time, I'm always coming up with like I'm always coming up with like new questions or new insights. Sometimes I'll hear you a lot of times I'll hear you say something that maybe didn't click for me when we were recording, but it clicks for me like when I'm listening to it. So it's like for the whole next week that I'm editing it and getting it ready to publish, I'm going through this whole second stage of, thinking about the topic and it ends up sticking with me, even more, which has been cool.
hmm I'm looking over the episodes and it's kind of cool to look at them as like a little collection of things that we've done too.
I think at some point, and I think it was fairly early on, we kind of noticed that there was some sort of theme, or there were some certain themes that maybe aren't present on every single episode, but I think for the most part, you see sort of a trajectory. It might have been the Schopenhauer episode. It might have been episode two, where we first started and we made that jump from, okay, Hegesias, someone that logics people into starving themselves to death, to Schopenhauer, who, just logics himself into, asceticism, to Heaven's Gate, who they're compelled, convinced by their beliefs to take what is arguably the most unnatural act. And I mean unnatural in the sense that it goes against our most basic instinct, the instinct for survival. A lot of the groups that we covered got into some dark territories, a lot of them involving uh, willful annihilation of one's existence, we could say. And
Yeah.
that sort of became sort of this nebulous theme around which a lot of the topics that we ended up covering, I think, sort of converged. But maybe more broadly speaking, and I think we saw this especially with the Munster episodes, was just this idea of how can this theme of how can ideas become, as you say it a lot, reified in shocking acts in many cases and just exploring that. And maybe I don't even know that we necessarily came up with an answer to the question. I think that's where the aphoretic stuff comes in, where we might just be ending with a question, but framing the discourse around these groups in those terms, I think is something that, I would like to see more people do. There doesn't necessarily have to be an answer to these questions. It's also more about just like, are we asking all the questions that are available? Are we asking the right questions?
Yeah.
Instead of framing it in like oh my God, how crazy do you have to be to buy into this or that belief system? It's like, apparently not that much. Apparently, you can buy into a lot of these belief systems by actually being a very rational person. That
Yeah.
should, you know, be something we should be talking about more, I
Well,
think.
this is one reason why I brought Roy Rappaport into it, and I've done more research on him since, and I'd like to, do a further episode about him because I really think his ideas are extremely fascinating because he's dealing with this kind of idea that I think we've been looking into. Because and he believes that ritual is like this epistemic foundation for people. And he also views ritual as having its own logic to it. In fact, he views it as a formal cause of the behaviors under ritual. So if you know about formal cause in Aristotle, it would be like the explanation of the thing. There's certain things that are entailed by the form of ritual. And so when I look at some of um, these events like the Heaven's Gate suicide, the Munster Rebellion, the Manichaeans, if we just kind of look at the form of the ritual and then we look at the substance, we can start to get a picture of why these things happen. And that's just one theoretical framework, right? We don't have to use that. But I just thought that, yeah, it's like, even though he might ostensibly seem out of place with all these weirdos, um, I think he does provide some analysis that could be used to look into it. And I think going forward too, just some thoughts I've been having for myself, and I meant to share them with you, but we've been both been busy the last few weeks, or the last week I think really. But the I like having a narrative to it, and I feel like maybe we can try to capture that as we're going. It doesn't have to be a grand specific narrative, but
Hmm.
we're having like a thread that we're looking at towards.
Yeah, no, I really like that. I think that's something that you're really good at, and it's something that I see in a lot of the medieval stuff that you've talked about with me, and you've been doing some Discord lectures on that recently, which have been cool. And that's something that you told me quite a while ago because I was asking you for some feedback or some advice about like organizing something that I was working on. And that was one of the things that you told me was like, well, it helps to have a narrative that you're, or a thread, you know, especially when you're dealing with like these long periods of history where there are so many moving pieces, figuring out what to include and what not to include, what to accentuate and what not, um, and having some sort of narrative, some kind of story to tell, is
Yeah.
really important. So that's definitely something I would want to explore more next time around.
Yeah, and I'll give an example because Munster is interesting. In a lot of books about the Reformation, Munster gets kind of put in the center. It's kind of like where the radical Reformation comes to a head, and it kind of goes on the back foot, and then the magisterial Reformation, the more moderate one, that starts to take over. So Munster Rebellion is kind of seen as like the centerpiece of the change of guard, I guess.
Yeah, I think in the first part you described it as where the rubber meets the road.
Yeah, because it's like we're very serious about this. Like this is what the truth, right? Like what else can there be but a revolt against the old order? I mean, I just feel like it's ideologically entailed by the concept. This project's I know it hasn't got a lot of views, but it feels like the views that people have taken from it have been very impactful to the people who've watched it. So I really appreciate like everyone that's been viewing and giving us feedback. I There's been like one or two comments I've seen that have been kind of stupid, but overall, I just feel like people have been really open minded and supportive of us. So I'm happy with that, and I'm glad that this is more for us. I think personally, I mean, I you can maybe speak to yourself, but for me, it's just like I love ideas, I love exploring them, and so it's really fun to just put it out there, regardless of where it goes. Like I'm not concerned about if we become famous or anything like that.
Yeah, no, I think I feel the same way. Like just having this as something, to look forward to each week with someone I enjoy talking to, and enjoys exploring some of the same unusual topics that I like to kind of dive into head first. Has been great. I have enjoyed some, the comments that I've gotten on the videos. I've also enjoyed some of the feedback that we've received, sort of one-on-one, whether it's people, in real life, friends and family that have listened to it and have talked to me about it, or people that we know on Discord that have messaged you or me with you know, feedback and, comments. Um, it's you know, I definitely would like to see more people doing this kind of work, these kind of philosophical analyses of religious movements, these sort of like analyzing the belief systems themselves as belief systems, instead of just trying to reduce everything down to psychological reaction formations or whatever. Not that there's no merit in that at all. It's just like how much more of that do we need? I don't know. Maybe I should I'm speaking out of turn there a little bit. I don't know, but
No, no.
I want to create stuff that I would want to listen to. Like I enjoy when these get published. I always listen to them at least once, and I enjoy listening to them. And that's kind of what I want to do is I want to, if there's something missing out there in the YouTube world, that I would like to listen to and I don't find it anywhere else, I'm like, well, I guess I'll just make it, or I'll find somebody else that wants to make something with me, and then it'll be out there, and people can build on it, if they want.
I think I'll fire a few shots too, because I think there's another side to that. I always do this in the episode. I'm not gonna call everyone, but when I see people doing online philosophy is fraught with problems, right? And I think one problem is everything is reduced to these specific views like determinism, anti-realism, realism, even like veganism, uh, objectivism, all the isms, right?
Hmm.
And
Death by
it gets to the
ism.
point where you just have like a word for every single view, and all you're doing is breaking down the idea and like trying to like um, do some kind of like internal critique of this what you perceive of as the argument and what you think like the parameters of the debate are. And I feel like it's very stifling. And I even see people who like they'll spend a whole hour like talking about armchair philosophy and how bad it is, but I never see them do anything but talking about like this very niche little philosophical topic. Like I never see them trying to apply it to anything. So I think like and we have our own problems. People can take critiques of our analysis. I will accept them, but I think we try to apply what we do to something meaningful and try to get like how do these ideas actually affect people? How do they inform people? And so I think it's not the most popular thing, but I think this is what I'd like to see in philosophy is like what actually use this stuff. Look what it does to people. Analyze it, analyze a real event and see what comes out of it. Don't just um talk about what we call like the problem of evil, right? Look at the Manichaeans, see how evil actually affected them. Look at Heaven's Gate, see where people's views of evil took them, right? Don't talk about just atheism versus theism or utilitarianism and hedonism. Look at Hegesias, see where hedonism takes someone, right? So I just that's kind of my perspective on it.
Yeah, I mean, I think every time I explore another belief system, it always ends up resulting in me exploring my own beliefs, and I've talked about this in other places too, where, especially when it comes to actually sitting down and talking with people that subscribe to belief systems, um, it always changes the way that I interact with people, like just in general. Whenever I hear somebody who is describing like their own philosophy of life, their own worldview that they have sat and created for themselves, that is something that I've gained a very deep appreciation for. I think that I don't think I always had. I think in the past, like a lot of people, I reacted to that with you're breaking the rules. You're not coloring in the lines, bad, you know. Now I'm kind of like, fuck yeah, let's color outside of the lines. Coloring inside the lines is boring. I've been doing that for years. I want to see somebody who's saying, let's throw out the coloring book entirely. Let's start drawing on the walls. Let's see what happens. That's why I like talking to these people that kind of create their own way of looking at things, and but especially when it's something that they are actually taking and applying in their own life. Like you said, like I don't really like engaging with a lot of the philosophical debates that are sort of in vogue today. Like when people start asking me what my meta ethics are, I'm like, dude, I don't know. I have no idea. And maybe that makes me uninformed. It does make me uninformed. I am
Yeah, yeah.
uninformed on a lot of that stuff. And I don't think there's anything wrong with necessarily with focusing on a particular niche in philosophy. Like I kind of focus on a very weird hill to die on, which is just take a look at Heaven's Gate. They're actually pretty interesting. They actually have a
Yeah,
very robust belief system. This is something that and a lot of the responses that I get from people, whether it's on Reddit or
I saw
on
some of them.
YouTube,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, they're just like, oh, I feel so bad
Sugar
for these people. Oh, you
sugarcoating a death cult or whatever.
yeah, we were accused of sugarcoating a death cult, which if that's all you think they were, then I'm sorry, you really don't know that much about them.
Well, also ignoring when we introduced the suicides and we're like, this is where they go bad. Like this is not like
Mhm.
no one was endorsing that.
Yeah, well, that's the thing is like there's only two categories. Either you're constantly talking about how crazy and dangerous these groups are, or you're sugarcoating it. I think I think this is something that I've talked about with people recently is like, what am I trying to achieve? Like in terms of like deciding like, do I want to try and publish more academically? Do I want to keep publishing stuff on places like YouTube? And I think one thing that somebody pointed out to me not long ago was like, well, think about who you're trying to reach. And something like Heaven's Gate is like, I would like, if possible, to reach the people who are watching the documentaries on Netflix and HBO and seeing these sort of shockumentary type things. I would like to reach those kinds of people. And where are those kinds of people? Well, they're usually the same kind of people that are consuming a lot of true crime podcasts, cult documentary stuff. All this stuff is very podcasty,
Yeah,
type
spiritual
stuff.
aliens
So,
type stuff. Yeah, stuff like that.
mhm. Well,
Conspiracies.
Ancient Aliens is an awesome show. It's just a great show.
No, I have my own guilty pleasure. I love like what part of the Bible was the spaceship in? Even though I know it's bonkers, like I always just have a sweet tooth for it.
But I think, yeah, and I think my interest in Ancient Aliens is different though from my interest in something like Heaven's Gate. And also side note is as far as I understand it, the Heaven's Gate people that are still alive today, they're not fans of Ancient Aliens, the show,
Yeah,
the
yeah,
Ancient Astronaut Theory,
yeah,
and most likely the if Ancient Aliens was like a thing at the time, I don't think Doe would probably he would probably, if I had to guess, he would probably say they got some stuff right, but not all of it, because like there's a lot that doesn't, it's not a one-to-one thing. Like just because
yeah, yeah,
yeah, like the way Heaven's Gate understands quote unquote aliens is a lot more nuanced than what the ancient
yeah,
astronaut theorists say.
yeah. I
But I
was
think
just
my
thinking about
interest in
like,
them is more like it's different because one question I ask is like, what is the praxis of somebody? Like somebody who is like a conspiracy theorist and believes in like that the government is hiding things about aliens. Like a lot of those people, there is a praxis, and the praxis is we need to release the truth. That I think praxis is an appropriate term to describe that. It's a
well, now
practical application of their beliefs.
we're back to the truth part too. That I was
Hmm.
talking. So I do think I mean I think that's really big. It's the truth.
But with ancient aliens, like the ancient astronaut theorist stuff, I don't know what their praxis is. I
I
don't
don't.
know that they have any, really.
Yeah, well, I would. yeah, when I was referring to is like the watchers though, like not that people are in like actually researching it, like because
Oh, right,
it's just to
right.
me that's like a lot of the stuff you see that people watch and consume is like you said, true crime, cults. I think aliens are really big now. Things about what else? Conspiracy theories I think are big. Um, yeah, just I feel like there's just certain things that people gravitate for casual listening.
Yeah, I'm definitely one of those people that will put on an episode of Ancient Aliens to help me fall asleep,
Yeah.
you know. I think that's like a whole subculture of people.
I've been into I've been into like weird space stuff. Like I've been putting on space videos lately.
Yeah.
Like top 10 craziest things in space. That's how I fall asleep. It's just like the pulsar star will tear your body into a you'll get what is it, spaghettiized or whatever. Yeah, so I don't know.
When I
Um
was when I was part of the anti-philosophy uh coalition that I started with somebody that we both know.
yeah.
We were developing this concept of like whether philosophy logically terminates in jumping into a black hole. Like if you were given the opportunity that like because philosophers love to philosophize about everything, that they would be unable to resist the temptation to leap into a black hole,
Well,
regardless
we
of what
got
happens or something.
Empedocles who leaped into the volcano. He couldn't resist, right?
Oh, I'm not aware of that. That's a whole. We'll have to do
Yeah.
a topic on that at some point then.
Well, he thought he was a god and he had to prove it. And so he jumped into
Oh,
the volcano.
okay.
This is supposedly how he died.
Interesting.
Yeah. Um, I mean that the pre-Socratics could be a whole series of itself. But I think enough people have done them too.
Yeah. Well, there
Um,
might be a maybe there's a narrative there that hasn't been explored yet. We could take a look at.
yeah. So yeah, you want to wrap it up there?
Yeah. Yeah, I just and thanks, man. Like these episodes that we've been working on have been they're like the highlight of my week, a lot of times. So it's been really enjoyable.
Yeah. No, I always look forward to it.
All right, man. Well, we'll definitely keep everyone posted when we start releasing new episodes. Definitely check Spotify maybe in the next few weeks. I'm gonna try and start working on getting maybe some of these episodes onto Spotify, but it usually takes a little bit of time to
Yeah,
process.
I was looking into it too. I was thinking, because we also split it up and like we'll put them on. You can run the YouTube and I can run the Spotify, and then we can just divide the labor.
Yeah, yeah, that works too.
I don't mind leaving them on your channel. I think you have a lot of views, so it might just help us. And
Hmm.
then it can live in the Spotify,
Yeah.
and it can be like kind of like you're doing a guest presentation of your side project on your YouTube channel.
Yeah. Yeah.
Cool. All right.
All right, man. Well, great talking to you. We'll talk soon.
Yeah. Peace out.
All right.